Hey guys, welcome to the Tech Tips for Leftfield House. Now, Leftfield House can be kind of a catch-all genre in a lot of ways, but in this case, we're focusing on the production style of artists like Kaytranada, who have elements of EDM and hip-hop and R&B and lots of other good stuff too. So we're gonna go over some drum selection, some sound design, effects, and some of my favorite routing tricks to make your workflow quicker, because my goal is for these tech tips to be useful, not just for Leftfield House, but in the genre that you like to produce in as well. So let's jump in. So let's talk about chopping up drum breaks, and specifically this drum break, which if you listen to the previous tech tip, you'll notice I got pretty excited about the prospect of doing this one. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can chop up a break like this. And the easiest and most straightforward way, and not my preferred way, but definitely one way that you can do it, is just to click Slice to New MIDI Track, and you can select how you want Ableton to actually attack slicing up this loop, because there's lots of different methods that it can use. So you can use like the warp markers that you placed inside of the clip. You can use the transients, which is basically like anytime there's a blip in the waveform. And then you can use any sort of time division based on your track if you want to do it that way as well. So if you press OK, then it'll create a new MIDI track, and it'll kind of recreate what was recorded here with MIDI notes of each of the slices. Now, this is a nice way to work if you just want to do something quick and dirty and you want to start playing around with your slices, right, on your keyboard. But the downside to working this way is that, let's say you wanted to process all of the hats inside of your groove, then you'd have to, let's say if you double click this, you can see what's happening in the sampler on each of these pads inside of the drum rack. Now, let's say that I had, this particular hat hit, and I just adjusted the flags here. This is fine, but like if I added some EQ, and let's say I wanted to make it brighter or something, and we added just like a like a shelf or something here. The problem is that it's only applying to this particular hat and not all the hats at once, because I want all the hats to be a little bit brighter. So this is why I don't prefer working this way, because you don't get control over the groups of instruments, like all the snares and all the hats and all the kicks at the same time, which is how I like to be organized and process things. So what I prefer to do instead is I'm going to delete this track, and then I'm going to press Command-Shift-T, and I'm going to open up a drum rack, and we're going to call this one, let's say, like the snares. So now what I'm going to do is go up to the left here, and I like to start working from C3 because it's in the middle of the keyboard, and I don't want to have to, if you're working on like a small keyboard, it's not as convenient to have to shift up and down octaves all the time. So I like to start working with the pad on C3. So now what I'm going to do is just drag this pad, or drag this loop over to this pad here, and when I press C3, going to play through the whole thing because it's on one-shot mode, and that's how one-shot mode works. But if you go to Classic and you press C3, it's also going to do the same thing because I have the release all the way up. But now if I press it, you get control of it a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this flag over till it lines up with the first snare drum, and drag this flag over here, right? And also, by the way, you can hear that hat in the background too, which is, again, one of the reasons I like working with drum breaks, is because you get all the grouped instruments like in the recording itself, which is kind of nice. You can also turn off this snap button, and that allows you to, it will snap to, I think, a zero crossing, which is basically like where the waveform hits the line. It's not super important that we talk about this, but it makes it so that it ends at a good point instead of like ending on a click. So you can turn that off and make sure that it goes all the way to the next transient, which is how I prefer to work. So we call this like, snare 1, and we can maybe set an envelope that we like. So Yeah, maybe this is okay for our purposes. And I kind of like to turn the attack to about 2 milliseconds, just so we can avoid any clicks at the beginning as well. So now what I'm going to do is hold Alt. I'm going to drag this next snare hit to C#3, right? And it's going to be the same hit right now, but let's just drag the flag to what looks like the next snare. Yeah, right here. And what's nice too is that since we copied and pasted it, it also copied and pasted all of our envelope settings and everything else. The next thing I'm going to do is copy it over one more time because I know there's at least 4 snare hits, right? So let's move this to D3, right? And we're going to do it one more time so we can get 4 snare hits that all sound a little bit different, that we can use interchangeably to give our groove a little bit more of a live feeling of a bounce here. So see how all those sound a little bit different instead of so it's pretty nice to have that type of flexibility. So now let's just make sure that we change these and stay organized so we know which one is which, snare 3 and snare 4. So yeah, this can be our snare rack. And what I like to do from here is actually open up, if you go up to the top left and go to show hide macro controls, these are really nice if you haven't used these before because you can assign these macros to control other things inside of the sampler. So in this case, what I'd like to do is have control over the envelope of all the snares at the same time. Because if you make any adjustments, once again, we don't want to just sit there and copy and paste all of the settings. We want to be able to do it in one fell swoop. So I'm going to go to my first snare pad here, and I'm going to right click the attack knob, and I'm going to go to map to macro 1. And we're going to do the same thing with decay, sustain, and release to their corresponding macros. And now what I'm going to do is I'm also going to go to this controls tab, and I'm going to map the transposition to another macro. I like macro 8 because it just I like it being separate from the other knobs, but it's not too big of a deal where you place them. So now we have control over the envelope with the macros. And what we want to do now is if you click over to snare 2, you'll notice that none of these macros are assigned, which is an issue because we want them to control all the snares at the same time. So if you go back to snare 1 where you originally assigned your macro, you can right click and press map to all siblings for each one of these. And now we go to do the same thing with transposition. And now if we change the attack to 20 seconds, for example, you can see that on every snare hit, it's 20 seconds. So any changes that you make are going to be the same across every snare hit, which is exactly what we want. And I basically just do the same thing now with all of the other hits. So I like to have a closed hat loop or a closed hat sampler and a kick sampler and maybe even an open hat one, and you just apply the same process. And when you go through and make your groove, you use separate samplers. So this might be your kick sampler, and you go through and you do your kick and you do your snare and you do your hi-hat. And then this way, I can add like an EQ or some saturation or whatever it is that you want to add, and you can control all of them at the same time. And the bonus to having these variations is not only that it sounds better as you make your beat with each individual snare hit, but when you do these rolls, for example, it sounds better than when you just try it with one, right? So if you like to do like snare rolls or you like to add in little fills here and there, it's really, really helpful to have control over all of these hits at the same time, but also keep them separate from the rest of the drum loop rather.